but I would also be recording it. A very good morning, evening to all our viewers from all across the globe. Today we have with us a very empowered and special guest. Her name is Jessica Robinson. She's presently leading sustainable finance at EY Parthenon. Earlier, she has worked with United Nations PRI, Association for Sustainable and Responsible Investment in Asia, Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, and others. She's not only a professional, she's also an author and has recently authored her first book on financial feminism, A Woman's Guide to Investing for a Sustainable Future. She has completed political science from London School of Economics, MSc in Applied Environmental Economics, BA in Economics, and has worked in Middle East, North Americas, and Asia, including India and China. A very warm welcome to you, Jessica. How are you doing today?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
It's an honor to have you with us. Jessica, you studied politics and environment in master's and undergrad, and went on to lead different roles in the organizations such as UN-PRI, Moxie Future, ADGM, and others. How has your journey been?
Well, when you say it like that, it sounds very eclectic. Yeah, I've had a very interesting journey, and I like to think that that varied sort of both in terms of geographies, but also the roles that I've played have sort of made me good at what I do now, which is very much around ESG strategies, sustainable finance strategies. You're right. I started in my undergrad was politics and economics, actually, because I genuinely wanted to be a politician. And then I realized quite quickly, actually, my first job was working for a politician. But then I realized quite quickly that politics is not always the way to change the world. So I sort of shifted. I did a master's, and then I actually did a second master's in environmental economics. And I'm quite unusual in that I've been in the sustainable finance ESG space for sort of 18 years now. So, and I say that makes me quite unusual because there are not that many people who've had that length of experience. It's probably showing my age a bit. And during that time, I've lived and worked. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. But then I was in New York for a while. I then moved to China. I was in Beijing for a few years, then in Hong Kong for many years, and I'm now in the Middle East. So my perspective is, I think I like to say my perspective is fairly global. And you know, my real focus on sustainability, ESG has been a huge passion of mine for many, many years. I often tell the story that actually when it first hit home for me, I was living in Beijing, and I'd had my two daughters sort of back to back. So I had these two babies, and I was really struck, and some of you may remember when Beijing was very polluted. And I was really struck at how we were all sort of running around thinking about global development, and yet we were creating a very polluted world. And that was a good, 18 years ago. And that's what really sort of drove me into the environmental field. Now, I've always been in financial services and industry. So I sort of went back to school and thought about how does the environment play into financial services? And that's really how I ended up in sustainable finance. But now, when I got to that point, my journey then has been quite eclectic in that I've done sort of private sector work, but I've also worked with the public sector, and I've worked with governments, I've worked with regulators as well. So when I was in China and then Hong Kong, I did a lot of work with the Hong Kong and Chinese government on green finance policy. So what do we need to do to really incentivize companies, financial institutions to start thinking about climate, and environmental challenges? And then subsequently, I was head of Asia for the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, worked ran a couple of think tanks. So I did quite a mix of stuff, both, as I said, across the public and the private sector. So I think that gives, I like to think it's enabled me to see both sides. So understanding the private sector and the corporates, but also understanding governments and policy as well. And then I came to the Middle East about 6-7 years ago, which has been fascinating as well. And another journey, I think, really sort of having been in Asia and seen a lot of the developments around sustainable finance in Asia, then really understanding what's happening in the Middle East. And obviously with COP28 last year, it's been quite a phenomenal shift in attention and interest, I think, from the private sector. But I can talk more to that in a minute if you want. The only other thing I would just add that, as you mentioned, the book I wrote, I do a lot of work on gender finance and financial feminism, because I'm a huge believer that women are leading the front in terms of climate and sustainability. And one of my sort of hobbies is really how do we empower women to really do more in terms of climate change and sustainability. So, and I'm working on my next book. So that's sort of an intro from me.
That's very inspirational. What is your next book on?
It's staying with the theme of female leadership, but I'm looking specifically at women in the Middle East who are looking at climate. And I'm looking across the different sectors and different roles. So, finance and business is one part of it, but so is policy, government regulation, as well as things like culture. So I really want to look across the different roles that women play. The idea being that I want to shine really shine a light on the amazing women that are out there, and really create some kind of blueprint of how younger women can get engaged and what we need to do to really support them in stepping into these roles.
Yeah. Perfect. So now, as a practitioner of sustainable finance, what are the fundamental principles according to you?
So sustainable finance is an interesting, and it's interesting because you'll hear different definitions. Really, when we talk about ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, that's really sort of, it's quite a broad church of risks and opportunities. And I think sustainable finance is the way in which we consider ESG and integrate ESG into our finance and investment decision making. And this happens at all levels, right? So obviously you have your big institutional investors, your sovereign wealth funds, you have your banks, your insurance, all the way through to private banking, retail banking, and family offices. But really the philosophy behind it is that how we use capital and the choices we make around how we allocate capital are critical, right? At any point we make that decision, we can choose to invest or move capital towards, say, for example, a green infrastructure project, or say you're a bank and you want to offer services to female entrepreneurs or something. At any point you have to make that decision. Now, historically, those decisions have generally been about profit maximization. Ultimately, we now know that there's a hidden cost. There are costs in everything. So that our use of resources, our natural world, and so forth. So sustainable finance is really a reflection of that. And I think over the last 10 years, it's become a lot more sophisticated in terms of understanding what those opportunities are, but also really how important it is to move capital at scale to really support the transition. And I think it's exciting as well. I genuinely believe this is the future of, it's not just the future of finance, it's just the future of the way we deliver businesses and the way we grow. So I do quite often say to my clients, don't be put off about all of the terminology we use. The concept is actually really simple. It's about using capital to create a better world. And it really comes down to very, very simple philosophies and principles. And then you obviously get into the complicated bit about how you actually do that.
That's very interesting. I have one question for you. Now, in MENA, since you're working out there, are there any laws and regulations on ESG or CSR on sustainable finance? Are there?
Yeah, and I think what's been interesting, and this is why I sort of gave the global context of my background, because MENA was a little bit behind the curve in terms of regulations and policies and laws. Obviously you may be aware, the European Union, there's so much in place now, almost so much regulation, it's quite burdensome. And I know that from my colleagues and my professional network. And I think what we've seen in MENA is very much a catching up. The one good thing being, obviously, when you look at things like sustainable finance taxonomy, so how do you define what is sustainable versus what is not? You do need law, sort of regulations and definitions. And I think what's happened is with the EU, because so much energy and thought has gone into the taxonomy, that actually it presents a lot of opportunities for regulators and governments in more developing markets to actually leverage those as well. So in MENA, yes, particularly in the UAE, the regulators have been very progressive in terms of issuing sustainable finance frameworks and guidelines. I think Saudi as well is really starting to gather speed. And so I think it's very interesting. But one thing I do want to just highlight that I think is important about this region is that this is not just about ESG, it's not just about risks, it's about the whole transition of the region. And I think, obviously with an oil dependency, or rather a lot of the wealth from oil sources, a lot of the governments are really looking around diversification. And so what we've seen around that economic diversification is huge investments going into things like climate tech, renewables, right across the board in terms of different types of investments that you may not necessarily have expected, but because of the speed at which change has happened, it's really exciting. And I think also and hopefully all of you are sort of watching and familiar with what came out of COP28, but the fact that COP28 was here in the UAE was so significant. And there were many announcements, there were many commitments made. I think like over 90,000 visitors to COP28. So I managed to speak, I think it was 9 events. So I was I'm sort of in and out of COP all day, but all over the 2 weeks. But I think the positive messages that came out of COP28 is that the Middle East is very serious about this. We have to start transitioning. And the significant capital that's required, we need to start bringing it to the table. And that I think, is what we're now sort of saying, okay, how do we do that? The only other thing I would say is the governments here are actually very focused on sustainable development as well. So it's not just the energy transition, it is the sustainable development piece as well. And I think that's very important to highlight, particularly in the work that we do with financing institutions.
So, would you share some case studies in this wherein you have seen that the companies are integrating sustainable finance in their business or in the investment,
Yeah.
as you just mentioned?
Yeah, and I think one of the best ways to describe case studies is sort of reflect on some of the companies that I've worked at that do it well. Now, I mentioned before, ESG is a very broad church. So it's a huge universe of issues, and no one company can solve all of those issues, right, across the E, S, and the G. So I do say to my clients, it's very important that you start with a clear strategy, but a strategy does not mean you're going to fix every problem in the world. It's where are you going to focus? And I normally say that I think there's generally something around net zero, because we've set net zero targets. We have to have interim and then longer term targets. So whatever your strategy is, the companies that are actually brave enough to now say, okay, we are going to set a net zero target, that is a critical component as well. And I don't think any company will get out of setting some kind of net zero target. Now, doing that, setting that target has to be done scientifically. There's a lot of planning that goes behind it, but unless a company takes one step forward, it's never going to get anywhere. The good news is that there's so many global resources now. So you've got the net zero alliances, you've got the science-based target initiative. So many corporates, whether they're on the finance side or not, there's a lot of guidance and a lot of tools to use in doing that. So I think, so having that strategy clearly defined up front is critical. Being practical and being realistic in that strategy is another piece, and then ensuring you've weaved net zero into the business. And so those are the very important pieces. On the sustainable finance specifically, one thing that I think companies that do it well are really understanding the innovation that sustainable finance can drive. There are many opportunities for innovation, say, for example, in different technologies, whether it's different services, green services, but actually thinking about how sustainable finance drives that innovation. And I do think the demand side of that is very much scaled up now. I don't think, 5 years ago, even the concept of sustainable finance was still sort of taking hold, even in the mainstream. the good news is that we now have in the market, both in this region, but also globally, loads of examples of green finance products. We've seen a boom in green bonds. We see a lot of thematic funds, investment funds, so around things like water scarcity, sustainable development goals, lots on gender. So I do think what we have now is tangible examples in the market of how sustainable finance has been used and how it's actually gathering steam. I think the other thing I would just mention on sort of good case studies is where you have to have ownership at the senior level. So companies that do this well will have clear mandates from the board, and also at the C-suite level. And that means that you have to have the right capacity and capability to deliver on sustainable finance, which means you probably need now a senior role. We've seen a lot of rise in the number of chief sustainability officers. So companies employing chief sustainability officers to really oversee all of this. And I think that's a very important best practice to have for a lot of companies. But also, I think, making sure that your board and your senior management are properly trained. Like, do they understand what climate risk actually represents? And do they sort of have in place the way they look forward and say, okay, what does sustainability mean to us in the short term, but also in the sort of the 10-year term as well? Because things are changing. I mean, as we've seen, right? I mean, look at how the weather changes have happened in the last year. The companies that do this well are the companies that are flexible, but also can see beyond the immediate. And I think those are the ones that will ultimately be very successful.
That's very well said.
We hope,
Um,
anyway.
yes, yes, indeed. Now, what are some of your key learnings and gaps that you may have identified from recommending policies to government, discussing with the investors, and working on the implementation front?
Yeah. So I think in terms of some lessons learned, and I sort of insinuated before that not knowing the answer is not a reason not to try. And so we are seeing companies that say, well, you have to put a stake in the ground, right? You can't say this is too complex and not do it, because that's just it's not gonna fly anymore. So I think in terms of the lessons learned, and certainly the work I've done with governments and regulators, is it's important to have policies and regulations that give industry clarity, because that actually builds confidence in the direction of travel in terms of policy. So I'll give you an example. Sustainable finance, when you look at the banks and you look at the investors, say a couple of years ago, they would be saying, okay, but we don't know how serious the government is on this. So actually having government step up and say, here is our vision, this is our sustainable development plan, gives the private sector confidence that this is the sort of journey that the country or the region is going to take over however many years. And financiers and private sector, they need that clarity and to sort of build the confidence that they're moving in that right direction. And I think that's why government policy is so important. I really also think, and it's not my area of expertise, but the whole discussion around reporting and disclosure, many companies, we've all been struggling with so many different standards, but finally they're starting to come together, which sort of reduces the burden on companies. We need sort of ease of reporting, because the reason we want companies to report is because we want transparency, right? And if it's so complicated, we're not going to be giving the right transparency, and that's actually not achieving it as well. And I think the only other thing to add to that is when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, when you look through them, this is sort of the closest we have to a global strategy. So as a strategy consultant, I like the Sustainable Development Goals because they are effectively a global strategy. So for the private sector, aligning what you do and aligning your leadership with the Sustainable Development Goals is absolutely common sense, because what we're trying to say with the SDGs is this is what we want the world to look like by 2030, right? So we're all going to want to move in the same direction. So if you're a company, or if you're an investor, an asset manager, there you have your blueprint, right? So be smart, use it, and actually use that to develop your own strategy of investing or whatever it is. Yeah. So one other learning I just remembered that's very important. People. It all comes down to people. So ESG, sustainability, climate change, it's all about people. So it's a massive opportunity to engage with your staff, your colleagues, the leadership, all across the board, because we all want the right outcome on this. So ESG and sustainability is not one person's responsibility. It's everybody's. And so when I work with clients, I always say, you have to make sure that everybody understands this agenda, right? You might have a chief sustainability officer, but it's everybody's responsibility. But even more than that, it's sort of everyone's opportunity, because, it's not about compliance, it's about growth and equality and, making the world a better place, which I think is ultimately what we all want.
Definitely, definitely. Um, so IICSR is a dedicated institute for developing responsible business leadership by training, advisory, project implementation, and reporting. Having such a diverse experience that you have, what are the interventions you see that institutions or organizations like us could fulfill?
Okay, so I feel, I feel when I look around, and we talked a little bit about what successful companies look like. I think authenticity is very important in 2024. And I think that is important on a corporate level as well. And I think, we come back to the board and senior management. You always have to have the right tone from the top. If you don't, it's not going to be taken seriously. And it's down to the CEO and it's down to the board to understand what sustainability is, both in terms of the impact on the business, but again, as I said, on the people, because it really is critical that there is leadership around this. So I do try to sort of spend time with senior management to really help them understand what ESG and climate, etc., sort of represents to them. There's quite often a sort of running to the thinking about the risk piece, but it's not. It's about the opportunity piece. It's about where are their new businesses? What is the innovation you can bring to market? How can your teams support it? There's so much that goes with even things like brand loyalty, employee loyalty. This is what younger generations want to see. So in terms of that leadership, to me, it's nothing. It's not just risk. It's massively about the opportunity.
And we as an institute, what are the interventions you see that we could take? Maybe in capacity building, if there is a particular course that you think we should conduct, or if there is something that is missing in the existing ecosystem that we could fulfill.
Yeah, I mean, the capacity building is really important. And I see this a lot, particularly on the work I do on gender. So actually bringing together like-minded stakeholders to talk about things like gender finance. How do we accelerate access to finance for female founders, particularly in the climate space? So, I mean, I think capacity building is critical. However, we need to move to impact. And this, I know it's very tricky, but we can do lots of talking. We can have strategies and stuff, but unless we're having the impact we want, it's sort of a futile exercise. And I think as your institute and as practitioners in the market, what we need to really hone in on is what is the positive impact we're looking to have, and how do we then measure it? And I think I was having a discussion actually earlier today with a colleague. The problem is people they rush to things like, well, we've had X number of social media likes. To me, that's not good enough, right? That's an easy KPI. Like, let's be more ambitious, right? Let's say, okay, the number of women who've managed to access a loan to build a climate solutions business, for one thing. The number of sustainably procured products we've sold versus less sustainable. Actually putting some hard targets around things, I think, is really important, and I don't think we should shy away from doing it either. So that would be my sort of really strong recommendation to you and the institute.
That's a very much practical approach. We all need to do that for sure.
Yes.
Jessica, it has been wonderful talking to you. Any message to our viewers?
Firstly, my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. I think just the final thing, coming back to the people component, let's not forget this is about us. And let's not forget the interactions that we have with one another as colleagues and supporters. I think, as I said, that authenticity is not just on a corporate level; it's on a personal level as well. And I think, being out there and being brave about this being what we want, is something I really encourage people to do. And I say this to my kids all the time as well. It's like, this is our future. You just don't shy away. If you don't think something's right, stand up and say something about it. And so that would be my message to leave with, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's an honor to have you with us and learn from your plethora of experiences. It's very enriching discussion. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.